talking about the history of life on Earth. So we are going to kind of take a deep dive into evolutionary theory um, and talk about some very early beginnings. Um, talk about some major events, is the word I can place. These also going on. Major events in evolutionary history, what led to those events, and some mechanisms that help out. So, starting us off. Woo! All right. Uh, we need how to, or this is starting like way back. Using chemistry, geology, and physics, we have a hypothesis that chemical and physical processes produce simple cells in 4 stages. So, how did we get from a rock in space to a place where single and multicellular organisms exist, right? How do we get from an ancient atmosphere with little to no oxygen to the situation we have now? Um, there are some really cool scientific experiments where people have taken the like proposed composition of chemicals in the atmosphere and like made a small scale version of it to see if we could get things like amino acids to form. Um, if we have the time, either tomorrow or next week, I'll probably show you a little bit about it. It's definitely really cool. But this is the chemistry and physics stuff that led us to the point where we could make so this is like the origin of the first prokaryote and how we got from prokaryote to eukaryote. Yeah, not already. When we talked about mitochondria. So, 4 stages that allowed single-celled organisms to form in an ancient Earth. Before we get too into it, I didn't ask you. Okay. So, 1. That was a lot. We're going to highlight. Abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules. That's our first step. We have to get our like first like amino acid type thing, right? Because right now it's just a bunch of atoms chilling. So it is hypothesized that these formed in a couple different ways. One is deep sea vents, and the other is volcanic atmospheric interactions. Right, deep sea vents have a lot of weird chemicals and energies kind of surrounding them. Yeah. Uh, and volcanic atmospheric interactions again have geothermal, geocentric like chemicals coming up to the surface, which is what is going to help lead to these organic compounds. And then, after this happened, in order to get to a cell, the next step is to make macromolecules. So, step 1 is make small organic molecules. Step 2 is these organic molecules coming together to make macromolecules, carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. It is proposed that proteins and nucleic acids were of the first. Um, lipids and carbohydrates weren't super common in the beginning, but small nucleic acids, because nucleotides were some of those first organic molecules, and proteins, because amino acids were of those first organic molecules. were some of the first macromolecules. So, first things first, we need small organic molecules. It is hypothesized that these events or volcanoes are where those events happen. And then two was the synthesis of our macromolecules. So, getting from small organic molecules to our macromolecules. Step one and two. Step three are packing those molecules into protocells. Protocells are droplets with membranes that have an internal chemistry. So the first kind of steps of homeostasis, right? We've got a packaged group of chemicals that have a different environment than the outside of each other. Compartmentalize those small organic molecules and macromolecules in a new environment. That's what needed to happen. That's what needed to happen. And then finally, we need self-replicating molecules. So how can life persist if it cannot reproduce? Right? One of the main characteristics of life is that it is able to reproduce. So our first genetic material was most likely RNA because it has a couple different uses, right? RNAs come in handy a lot. We talked a little bit about enzyme catalysts, versions of RNAs called ribozymes, but they also have a role in protein synthesis. Just highlighting that. So, after we got our packaged membranes, right, our protocells, our pre-cells, we then needed self-replicating molecules, which was most likely RNA. RNA played a role in making more proteins, but it could also function as an enzyme catalyst. So likely it was catalyzing reactions first, and we then kind of developed this role in protein synthesis. We didn't necessarily have the foundation for protein synthesis within protocells. So these four things are like the conditions that led us to the point where we could then make or develop the first cell. These protocells are essentially just this little microbiome, right? And eventually they will have this energy disequilibrium that we associate with life. All right. So this is where we start relying on fossil records, right? These first four conditions are just what scientists believe needed to happen in order to get from a bunch of atoms and molecules to our first cells, right? Then, after we start forming cells, we can start relying on fossil records to teach us a little bit more, right? We can actually have fossilized evidence rather than speculation based on chemistry and physics. So, then we get to fossil records. Starting us off, our fossil dating system is called radiometric dating, which is based on the decay of radioactive isotopes. So they can look at a fossil. Look at a fossil, do a test on it to determine at what state of decay the elements in that fossil are. Because the rate of decay of a specific atom is different per element. And this is called the half-life. If you've taken chemistry, odds are you have experienced a little bit of half-life. Half-life is the time required for one half of the parent isotope to decay. So if something has a half-life of 20 minutes, if you have your parent isotope 20 minutes later, it will decay to half of its original state. And we know the rate of decay of most of these isotopes. So if you have a carbon, if you have a carbon molecule from billions of years ago, we know the rate of decay that carbon goes through if it is radioactive. And we can determine how old. That is our biggest, most common way of figuring out how old fossils are. Help us make a timeline of geologic time. That timeline is important to our discussion for today. So, this. Ooh, oh, that's so good. Some. This should be some, but my fingers messed it up. All right. Some fossils. Some fossils let us look at the origin of groups of species, right? We can't necessarily draw a direct correlation to single species a lot of the time, but we can figure out when certain groups of organisms came into play. The example your book gives is with mammals and the development of the jawbone, right? So mammals have a different jawbone than other groups of organisms, right? If you look at a snake's jaw or a fish's jaw, it's not going to look like the hinge system that we have or that other primates or animals have. So we can look at fossils from 300 million years ago, 280 million years ago, 220 million years ago, and 195 million years ago, and looking at the development of this jawbone, where at first this purple bone was in a more triangular shape, and eventually kind of grew outward a little bit until it had like two separate parts, and eventually became this sort of hinge mechanism that we see in modern day mammals. So we can look at fossils and focus directly on the jawbones and help group them together based off of this development. So as we look at all of these fossils, we can find groups of organisms that help us create a timeline. So this is our geologic record. That's what we needed fossils for, which is a standard time scale. This time scale lets us be like, okay, 300 million years ago, that's this time, or that's this eon, right? And we can have big key events in that geologic record to help us piece things together. The three we're going to talk about are the origins of multicellular life, the Cambrian explosion, and the colonization of plants. Yeah, I might have. Yeah. There's a YouTube video that has to do with the history of the world, and it mentions the Cambrian explosion. It's really funny, but I can't do it. I will do that at some point. So, um, this geologic record helps us divide up Earth's history. You've probably interacted with this geologic record at some point, um, if only in passing. So, I believe, yes, this is our geologic record. We have divided time or the history of the Earth into eons. We divided eons into eras, eras into periods, and then kind of as small as we go. Then we get to like current times. We talk about like decades and have actual names for years and stuff. So our eras are our Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. Those are our eons. Eons into eras, and then eras into periods. You've probably dealt with periods before. We've got Cambrian period, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Yeah. So this is our geologic history. Um, we have kind of come up with a new name for the current era we are in, because as humans develop and start affecting the world around us, we start calling that the Anthropocene, because anthro is humans, so the human affected Earth is kind of a new era in and of itself. If you've ever dealt with any media that has to do with John Green, he has talked about it. But this is our kind of timeline that we are going to work with. Starting us off, we need, before we get to our first key event, which is multicellular life, we need our prereqs. So, earliest record of life comes from stromatolites, which are, where was my fingers doing this? Binding. So, prokaryotes and modern prokaryotes do this as well, create something called a biofilm, where they excrete certain substances to help keep the groups of prokaryotes together, right? That's called a biofilm. It is one example of if you like accidentally forget to brush your teeth, or if your teeth just feel particularly gross, like they have that film over it. That is a biofilm. It is because of the bacteria that live in your mouth, right? So that on rocks, those rocks get stuck together because of that, and it can create fossils. And those are our first. That's our first record of life. So we need these first organisms, and after that, we have photosynthesis. The development of photosynthesis, the creation of this pathway, was our key into oxygenating the atmosphere. In order to have organisms that rely on oxygen, we need oxygen in the atmosphere, and right? So, at some point in time, one of these early prokaryotes developed the ability to harness sunlight and carbon dioxide to make energy for itself. Right? We talked a lot about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis oxygenated the atmosphere. And from there, we get the first eukaryotes through endosymbiosis, right? We talked about endosymbiotic theory way back when we talked about cell biology, and how somewhere there was a cell that was really good at cellular respiration, breaking down sugars, or photosynthesis, right? Plant cells. And it is hypothesized that somewhere one prokaryote swallowed up one of these very energy efficient cells and then put it to work. Eventually, that cell that it developed became more like an organelle rather than an individual cell. And that is kind of our first single-celled eukaryote, right? Because single-celled eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. That's our big difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So early eukaryotes were these prokaryotes that underwent symbiosis. Doing okay? All right. Now we have multicellular life, right? Our oldest multicellular life or multicellular eukaryote was an algae 1.2 to 1.8 billion years ago. That is a billion with a B years ago. So some sort of algae had multiple cells within it. And that was our first evidence. But our diverse multicellular organisms, our soft-bodied organisms, like little nematode worm-looking things, they showed up about 635 to 541 million M years ago. So there's a lot of time where the Earth was just small, photosynthetic, um, multicellular eukaryotes. That was part of the oxygenation of the atmosphere, right? The more algae we have, the more photosynthesis that happens. The more photosynthesis that happens, the more oxygen in the atmosphere, the more complex life gets. That is where we are in geological time. So from this 1.2 to 1.8 billion years ago mark to the 635 to 541 million years ago mark, it was mostly like small algal plants until we got to these soft-bodied worm-looking things. So, everybody following on how we got to a bunch of molecules of elements in the atmosphere to our first soft-bodied organisms? Okay? All right. So, this leads us to the Cambrian explosion. This is where we start seeing animal phyla appear in fossils in the early Cambrian period, which is 535 to 525 million years ago. So during this time, we've got a lot of animal groups that show up. This is the first time we are getting predatory elements in organisms, right? So this is called the Cambrian explosion because it is in the Cambrian period and it is a lot of organisms all developing all at once. So this is animal groups like sponges and mollusks. So we are starting to see things that look similar to what we see today. Before the explosion, everybody had really soft bodies. It was mostly photosynthetic organisms and like detritivores that are like doing ocean floor things. This is all also still in the ocean. All of this stuff is happening in the ocean. After the explosion, predators emerged. So we had features that allowed them to capture prey. Organisms figured out that they don't have to like surface feed or bottom feed in order to get nutrients from dead organisms. If they can capture and eat live organisms, plants or other small soft life. So as organisms started to develop the ability to consume other organisms, right? Natural selection would select for those that could protect themselves. So we start seeing hard shells and stuff like that. So the development of protection trait mechanisms developed at the same time as the predatory like claws and grabby things. And this is where we start seeing the forces of natural selection start to take place to influence where species go. Which is probably why we think about speciation, right? And how speciation depends on natural selection. As we have the ability for natural selection to take place, right, we're getting a lot of new species. And that is so 535 to 525 million years ago, we start seeing little critters in the ocean. So this was our second big key event in life history. All these little oceanic critters start to develop. Then we get the colonization of land. We had a billion years ago evidence that certain bacteria coated damp terrestrial surfaces. So if a somewhat damp area on land had the right conditions, we could get early cyanobacteria and stuff like that. But it wasn't until 500 million years ago that larger life forms colonized land. So 25 million years after the Cambrian explosion, we start to see animals on land. This was associated with adaptations, right? Because adaptations have to let us be able to survive in our environment. That let organisms reproduce on land and prevent dehydration, right? If you are an aquatic organism, you have to find a way to be able to store water and not dry out if you're going to venture out on land. So, this was the colonization of the land. We started with cyanobacteria coating damp surfaces, and eventually the aquatic Cambrians, right, started to venture out onto land, much like some like sea turtles, right? They live in the ocean, but they have their babies on land, and babies fall back into the ocean. That kind of thing developed. And as that kind of thing developed, they were like, oh, we can come up here and eat these cyanobacteria and not dehydrate. It's pretty cool. 500 million years. So, very long now. So, this was our kind of last big key event in geologic. So, now, now that we are on land and we have an established life history as to how our organisms developed, we are going to talk about speciation and extinction rates, right? Throughout time, there have been lots of new species that come and go. Right, there are scientists believe that most of the organisms, like 90%, maybe 99%, of all of life that was ever on Earth is now extinct because there are so many species that live in that aren't on anymore. So, we have these things called mass extinctions, where changes to the global environment cause the rate of extinction to increase dramatically, and we call those mass extinctions. So, there have been 5 mass extinctions documented over time. We call these the Big Five. And they are likely, we do not know for sure, but very likely caused by volcanic activity or asteroid strikes, right? Um, so big supervolcanoes erupt. We have geologic evidence that huge volcanoes erupt. When those volcanoes erupt, right, they throw a lot of ash into the atmosphere. As that ash gets out, the Earth gets cold, species die out. They have found that another one of these big five extinctions happened because of an asteroid strike, and they believe this because they didn't have evidence of a certain element or a certain isotope being around whenever before the asteroid strike, and then a large quantity of it, not large, but bigger quantity of it after the strike. They think an asteroid strike hit the Earth, and when it did hit the Earth, it threw up a bunch of stuff into the atmosphere and caused a lot of disruption. So, mass extinctions can wipe out a lot of. So, there are extinctions happening every day, like it is a natural part of life that extinction happens. This is called the background extinction rate. It is when we are out of that background extinction rate that we start losing mass. Okay. I think the next page. Yes. So, this blue line is the number of families or the number of like classes, right? Kingdom, phyla, order, family, right? That existed in all of these periods, and this is the extinction. You have 5 big extinction events: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These 2 are our big ones, right? This was the one that killed all of the dinosaurs. This one here is why we don't have dinosaurs. We think that one was the asteroid one. We think this one had to do with a massive supervolcano eruption. So as you can see, when this mass extinction hit, there was a large dip in the diversification of species, which slowly went up. There was another smaller dip at the 4th mass extinction. Right, there was another dip right here with this mass extinction, and slowly back up again. So the number of families doesn't kind of correlate with. Right? Any questions about how this gives us information about geologic history? All right. So humans, goodness gracious, autocorrect have threatened a lot of species to the point of extinction, right? Um, human actions have threatened many species to the point of extinction. We've wiped out rainforests. We've hunted species. We've pumped a bunch of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is slowly changing. So scientists think that we are beginning a 6th mass extinction, this one being all human caused rather than a natural disaster like a volcanic eruption or a asteroid strike. So we can calculate background extinction rates, and scientists estimate that our current rate of extinction is 100 to 1,000 times higher than that normal background extinction rate. And from there, and because we aren't necessarily reversing any of the things that we are doing, they estimate that to continue. And if it does continue, we are in a 6th. It's not necessarily fun, but morning, but really on. So this is kind of bringing us back up to time, right? Looking at history or looking at extinction through history, but we can also look at speciation through history. So this is called adaptive radiation, where we have periods of evolutionary change, where we have many new species that allow us to fill different niches. Uh, and we can calculate that a lot of these radiations happened after the five mass extinctions. So, because those number of families didn't plummet completely after each mass extinction, and that the number of families increased, right? That is called an adaptive radiation. We talk about adaptive radiation in biology as well as just the ability of one species to diversify into many different species through the process of speciation. So, adaptive radiations. One of the most common examples of adaptive radiations are Darwin's finches, right? With one founder species, and over time, as they filled different niches, right, they developed into different species through the process of species. So that is a kind of small scale version of what happened after each of these mass extinctions. Okay, two more. Nothing super crazy. These So we see a lot of big changes over time, right? Changes in body shape to get us from early mammals to mammals that look like the ones that are around today. This is because of gene regulation, right? We talked about homeox genes, or kind of touched on homeox genes, and how when we talk about development, right? How things like maternal proteins and those first regulatory genes, they are what develop body plans. Or we talked about Drosophila development, how that diploid protein was what made the anterior of the fly, and if you injected diploid on either side, right, you got a fly with two butts instead of two head and butt, right? That is caused by the regulation of developmental genes. And uh, when something happens, when there is a big uh, mutational change to these developmental genes, and if in the rare occasion that this uh, results in a differently shaped organism, right? We can kind of take those developmental genes, add them into the gene pool, and that is how we get major body changes. Uh, yeah, so uh, that is how we get things that go from like kind of looking like an animal that's around today to really looking like an animal. And finally, I'm going to hit one more time on the fact that evolution isn't necessarily striving for perfection, right? If natural selection were striving for perfection, we'd have something considered a perfect species, because then we have is crabs, because crabs have developed, or the crab body shape has evolved separately many different times. That's something really cool. I might integrate it into our review activities next week, not next week, week after next. But our so natural selection is influenced over time by small scale and large scale factors, right? Some not so good alleles can be hidden in recessive genes, right? Because natural selection only acts on phenotype. Um, so it's not like evolution or natural selection is working towards the goal of perfection. Also, environments change over time. So what is good for one environment might not be good for the next environment in something small changes. Um, yeah. And I don't necessarily give me a way out of that. That is crash course history of life on Earth. Um, any? We'll order this. Oh, I did talk this about this. Sorry about that. Tomorrow we'll start talking about phylogeny and how humans like to classify things, organize things, uh, and we'll talk about the molecular component to that on